Hi, friends. Welcome back to Amplify. The last few weeks, we've been talking about how Jesus breaks down boundaries that have been used to exclude people and extends an all inclusive, unconditional invitation to his table. We started out by looking at how patriarchy and gender hierarchy led to the subjugation and exclusion of women in the ancient world. And then we looked at how the nationalism of ancient Israel led to the exclusion and marginalization of different races, ethnicities, and nations throughout the biblical story. In each case, we saw how Jesus completely broke down those boundaries and radically welcomed both women and Gentiles to his table. This week, we want to begin our look at how patriarchy and nationalism, along with the holiness and purity codes of ancient Israel, affected sexual minorities in the ancient world, and how those themes work together to form boundaries that marginalized and excluded them from their communities and from approaching God. Boundaries that are still used to exclude LGBTQ plus people to this day. In the next few weeks, we're going to be taking a closer look at those boundaries and what Jesus and the biblical authors had to say about them. As always, we'll be considering not only what was written in Scripture, but also why it was written in that way, the context, culture, and language involved, and what that all means for our interpretation today. Since Jesus is the primary lens through which we must interpret all of Scripture, we're going to start with what he had to say about sexual minorities first. We're going to listen to Pastor Zach Lambert from Restore Austin Church once again. If you'll remember, I gave you a little of Restore's backstory some weeks ago. They were once a part of a church denomination, but were kicked out for including and baptizing an LGBTQ plus woman. And not only that, Pastor Zach lost his ordination because of it as well. But through it all, Restore continues to be committed to loving and fully including LGBTQ plus people. In this message, Pastor Zach will be talking about a passage in the Gospel of Matthew in which Jesus acknowledges sexual minorities. We've actually looked at this passage before when we were discussing how Jesus values women. So let me set the stage. If you'll remember, in Matthew 19, Jesus is confronted by a group of religious men asking if they can break their marriage covenants and devalue and discard their wives whenever they grow tired of them, as Moses allowed in the law. But Jesus quotes scripture back to them to call their attention to the fact that at the beginning, both men and women were created equally in the likeness of God as image bearers. And he reinforces how much God values and blesses all his image bearers and their committed covenantal relationships. Later in the passage, when Jesus' disciples question him about this, he elaborates by widening the gender boundaries and moving the trajectory of Scripture forward toward greater inclusion. Pastor Zach will help us to see how the trajectory of Scripture moves toward greater inclusion throughout the biblical story, from the law to the prophets to Jesus and right on through to his followers in the early church. In his message, you'll hear Pastor Zach refer to an Old Testament law, Deuteronomy 23:1 to be exact, that excluded anyone who had been emasculated, eunuchs, sexual minorities, from entering the assembly of the Lord. Now, if you'll recall from our previous look at excluding boundaries, the patriarchy and purity codes of the time would have viewed eunuchs as being not only damaged, unwhole, and defiled, and therefore unacceptable to God, but also effeminate. Remember, breaking the cultural gender norms of the time was seen as unnatural. For a man to be associated with anything womanly would have been seen as unclean, shameful, and an abomination. But as we'll see, God's scriptural trajectory of inclusion advances as we read in Isaiah 56 that eunuchs would not only be accepted, but they would be given a name better than sons and daughters. Then we'll see Jesus move the trajectory forward even further with his acknowledgement and acceptance of those who don't fit neatly into the sexual majority. And by the time we get to Acts 8 and we read about the baptism of the Ethiopian eunuch, the ultimate example of God's acceptance of those in the sexual minority and his desire to include them in his family, we'll see how the trajectory of Scripture has moved forward to a place of complete inclusion for all people. I love how Pastor Zach puts it in this message. These passages show us that full inclusion of sexual and gender minorities in the family of God is God's idea. When we use Scripture to marginalize and exclude people based on their sexual orientation or gender identity, we're actually working in direct opposition to God's design for his family and for his church. Jesus and the trajectory of Scripture shows us that God welcomes everyone to his table. And as followers of Jesus, called to love as he loves, we're to do the same. I hope you enjoy Pastor Zach's message. You can find it at restoreaustin.org in the all-inclusive God's Big Beautiful Family series. This message is titled Homophobia, Transphobia. When you finish, here are some questions to consider. What stood out to you or challenged your thinking in Pastor Zach's message? How did patriarchy, nationalism, and the purity codes serve as excluding boundaries for the Ethiopian eunuch? How do these boundaries still play out in the church and in the world today? How can we use the trajectory of Scripture we discussed tonight to open conversations and begin to break down these boundaries today? When we gather again as a big group on June 1st, we'll begin our look at the Scripture passages that have traditionally been used to exclude LGBTQ plus people. Once we can see the trajectory of Scripture and God's heart for all his people, we'll need to take another look at these passages to see what's going on and to re-examine how they have been interpreted in the past. We're going to start with the few passages that are in the Old Testament. The Sodom and Gomorrah story in Genesis 19 and its counterpart in Judges 19. Then a couple of verses in Leviticus, and then we'll finish up with a word about gender and marriage from Genesis 1 and 2. When we meet again on June 15th, we'll dive into the few New Testament verses, specifically those in Romans, 1 Corinthians, and 1 Timothy. Hopefully, this will give us a good biblical foundation to engage in the conversation around inclusion with our non-affirming brothers and sisters. We hope you'll join us in person or through our YouTube channel, youtube.com/amplifygathering. Hope to see you next time.